As you guys know, I do shows with the OBR as well as my shows here on this channel. And while doing one of these shows that's called Things I Think I Know with Brad Ward, me and Brad were having a conversation about the vibes in the Browns locker room being different despite it being the same players that are in that locker room. And I think it was a very interesting conversation that we had. So I want to share this clip with you guys here. Now, this is a early preview of a episode of Things I Think I Know that will come out later. If you want to see the full episode between me and Brad, where we discuss a lot more about this week's upcoming game, make sure you subscribe to the OBR and make sure you subscribe to this channel as well. Hit that notification button. But now, without further ado, here's the clip.
This team, they basically ran it back. There's a few new players on this team, but last year there was a feeling around this team. There was a togetherness, a selflessness that this team had bought in. They played with emotion and energy, and they were likable for those reasons. Q. They were so easy to root for because they had, remember Mike McDaniel talking about the Jets win and the galvanizing moment they had, and how cool that was to see of what everything they had overcome as a team, because it's always next man up, next injury, and everybody just kept stepping up. And my favorite scene of the season, Martin Emerson, leaning down and patting DTR's back, and while he's crying, and they just had energy and emotion, and they played with that, and they played for each other. And the crazy thing about the NFL is each season is its own entity, and it doesn't, a lot of people think like you can carry over some sort of momentum from one season to the other, and it's just not true. And same thing with culture. Like, culture is something you have to recreate every year, even if it's the same guys, because each season has its own ups, downs, things that you have to face, overcome, and how the human element of this becomes into play, where an individual is mentally at home, in the locker room, how they feel about their game, their coach. It's different than last year, and how they respond will be different. It's the human aspect of the game. And when you see a team like the Browns so far this year doing uncharacteristic mistakes, mental errors, playing, I don't want to say lifeless, but with not the same energy or passion, it appears, right? At times, you don't see the same buy-in. You don't see the same emotion. It looks like a bunch of individuals out there, not a team, right? And they haven't had, for some reason, that same moment or something that has galvanized them together. And that's clear by their play. And it's not a coincidence that this guy drops the ball, this guy drops the ball, this guy misses a tackle, that guy misses a tackle. It's not all individuals failing at once for one reason. It's an underlying, there's something going on there for me, Q. There's an underlying theme, or I'm not a big vibes or aura guy, but like, it's kind of like that, right? Like, there's something underlying that we can't see that is not right with this group.
Yeah.
And I think I know that from watching them.
This is why I love football, is because it is so many different things at the same time, right? And I think this is why we love sports, because it has so many different elements going into it at the same time. So this is going to be a more philosophical answer, I guess. I don't know if I have the proper language there to describe what this answer, the road I'm going to go down, what this is. But it is true. Like, I think what you're describing is each season is its own thing. It's its own narrative, right? Like, every season plays out a little bit differently. No season's going to play out the exact same. And like, I do think culture does get carried over, but momentum doesn't. You have to create your own momentum to sustain whatever culture is in there. And, like, we've, again, since we think about football and we kind of talk about it like these guys are just like machines that spit
Mm-hmm.
out stats, and we don't think about the human or the mental health side of this enough, we forget that each season means it's a different year for every person on there. Even if you bring back the same, you do this every year for Thanksgiving with your family, right? Or
Yeah.
if you're a viewer at home, whatever family event that everybody gathers for, each one is a little bit different because
Great
everybody's going through
analogy.
something different in their lives in that year. I mean, what I'm going through this year is different from what I went through last year. How I felt at this point this year is different from how I'm feeling last year. And we don't know what's going on in the lives of the 53 guys in there, but I guarantee you it's different than what it was last year. And that
Exactly.
changes things, right? You can't put a football team together in a vacuum. These guys have families, lives outside of this, other things go on. It might be that something's going on with a disproportionate amount of people at the same time right now, and maybe something galvanizes them and brings them together. It might be that something's going on within that locker room, but it's kind of, when you think about it, it's like, oh, what could be different, right? Because again, we get stuck in that mindset of like,
Yep.
okay, it's like Madden. You just bring the same
Yeah.
guys back. They got the same overalls. It should be the same exact team. But in practice, as human beings, and everybody's life is different a year from now, right? People have different anxieties. We have way more guys on contract years
Yep.
this year, which could create a situation where people are pressing, not because they're mad they don't have a contract, but because they really want a contract, right? Sometimes, and I remember this is way back in the day when I was trying to do acting, what they tell you as an actor is you are never going to get these auditions until you don't want that audition anymore. Right, because when you want the audition, you're doing all the acting, right? You're
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 pressing. Yeah.
performing through the text, and you're doing too much because you're trying to show everybody, look at me, give me a shot. But Steve Carell walks in, he doesn't care about getting this role in the off. He's like, all right, I do this, and he's taking all these choices that somebody went in, he's just taking it in a different direction. Meanwhile, you're like aggressively taking it safe, right? And I think
Yeah.
when you look at the Browns right now, they scream to me a team that's kind of stuck wanting to do that. You got a lot of guys who want to prove a lot right now. Defensively, I think that what happens is that early in games, they get super hyped up and then they get gassed out.
Yep.
Right. This has happened almost every game for the Cleveland. They got super hyped up at the beginning of Jacksonville. They got super hyped up at the beginning of the Cowboys game. Right.
Yep.
And that was kind of understandable because I remember I was talking to Tyvis about what does the preseason do for your conditioning. And
Yeah.
Tyvis brought up, it's like, hey, one of the things the preseason does is it calms you down for week 1 and 2 so that you're not getting gassed out because you're too amped up on the first couple of drives. And then you're sitting there patting, breathing because you can't handle yourself because you spent all that energy early on. I think that was a factor in the first 2 weeks of the season. Week 3 against New York, a similar thing happened where this team started out incredibly hot to start the game, almost got 2 turnovers, right? And then the rest of the game happens here. This week was a little bit different. Now, West Coast games, and I always bring this up because every time like a coach goes West Coast, everybody loves to bring up, oh, this coach doesn't have a winning record on the West Coast, especially if they're a coach from a team in the Eastern time zone. And it's like, yeah, well, just getting your team to play a game in a different time zone, a 3-hour time difference time zone, is really difficult.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not an easy thing to do. I bet it's a thing in the Premier League where you're jumping time zones across Europe and these different countries. It's a thing, right? Like these time zones are difficult to handle. They really mess
it's
up.
real.
There's a reason they exist, right? Like, so yeah, this game being a weird start, right? Where they got off to a slow start on the West Coast trip. That's not surprising. I mean, the same thing happened last year on the West Coast trips that they had. Remember those games against Denver and LA? We weren't really satisfied with the defensive output or the amount of energy that they had in those 2 games. So some of that could be that it was a West Coast trip, right? And it's when it's early in the season, we have the least information, but we want to be the most definitive about so many games that have to happen, that we kind of fall into certain conclusions. This is where I'm at with the team. They have had a disappointing start to the season. It's undeniable. Nobody's going to sit here and tell you this is exactly how we want the Browns to start the year. This has been a disappointment, even to the most cynical fan. This start was disappointing. Nobody expected the Browns to be 1-3, and if you did, you didn't expect them to go 1-3 in this way, where they're limping to one. Like, they're lucky to be 1-3 because Jacksonville is more of a mess than they are. And I think that is an important piece to acknowledge here. But you can start bad and have a disappointing start and turn it around during the season. This is where they're at. They have these problems. I agree with you. The intangible stuff seems to be bigger than the tangible stuff. And look, they do have some tangible problems. Defensive line play, Jim Schwartz's defenses. I always have this saying. I know people talk about, are you going to add these different looks here? Jim Schwartz has been running this defense since 2009. The idea that it's just going to get figured out, like, is hilarious, because, like, yeah, it's already been figured out. The strength of a Jim Schwartz defense is about the defensive line. If his defensive line is great, the defense is going to perform very strong. Right now, I think the problem is outside of Miles, and Miles is taking 72% of the snaps, I believe, this year versus his normal 81%. So he's taking less snaps because of the injury. And Miles is playing less. He's not just really good. Miles is all world, like, still out there with an Achilles injury, apparently. And he has 3 sacks to start the season. And people are still like, well, I expect more from Miles Garrett, right? It's not because those people are ridiculous. He's just that good, right? That you could expect more from Miles Garrett, even when he's playing at such a high level, despite all of these things. But when Miles is taking less of a load, you're leaning on what's the rest out there. And Zadarius Smith has been rather pedestrian as a pass rusher. He's been kind of a focal point of the attack for other rush games, right? You look at where teams run the ball, it's at right end and it's at middle left. Well, who are those two players? It's Quentin Jefferson and it's Miles Garrett. I mean, not Miles Garrett, and it's Zadarius Smith. There was a goal line play I saw in all 22 where they just send a tight end at Zadarius Smith, and Zadarius gets zoned out. Like, he gets zoned out on a goal line play where the Browns have the ball. They have a chance to get a safety here, and he just gets completely walled off by a tight end. It's unacceptable, right? Opens up a huge gap. 20-yard run.
Jefferson is terrible against the run. I mean, he can rush the passer, but that's about it. I mean,
and it's at the point where I'm like, I don't think he's good enough at rushing the passer to justify this. Like, this isn't a Larry Ogunjobi situation where Larry was like one of the best defensive tackles against to pass rush, but like awful against the run. So it justified it being justified you getting called out there. Like, I think Sam Kamara probably needs to play more. It's unfortunate what happened with Alex, right? Because I think he would have had an opportunity to slip in and out there at 3-tech, even though he has his own run defense issues. But I think his run defense issues are when he's called out there on edge, because he's just not a fluid athlete with his hips. His hips are terrible. That's been a problem since 2022. But Isaiah McGuire, I think, has showed some promise in that area, right? So I think he's going to play more. I think that was probably going to be part of the plan for him to play more. And I think this team is blitzing more. And, Brad, a lot of people, because he has such a good reputation, bring up Mike Vrabel.
Yep.
And we were talking about what's Mike Vrabel's influence going to be. Well, you're starting to see some of Mike Vrabel's influence.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to wonder, like, is it a universally good thing like we thought it would be? Because what did Mike Vrabel have issues with his last 2 years in Tennessee? His coverage units weren't great in Tennessee, right? He did not have...
the combination of Shane Bowen, him, and Schwartz have always had issues on the back end, right?
Yeah. And last year, the Browns didn't really have this many issues on the back end, but like, these issues pop up, especially, it's specific though, the issues the Browns are having. They're not really having a hard time holding up in like regular flat coverage, right? We're only sending 4 rushers. The Browns are having issues when they blitz, holding up on the back end and not allowing an immediate answer to the quarterback, which, if you remember, that was something the Browns took advantage of all day when they played the Tennessee Titans, right? Yes. And I think that's something that they have added to this team, where they're trying to get more sim pressure. They're trying to get a little bit more exotic, but we're seeing the same expectations that were there with Mike Vrabel start to get taken advantage of here,
Yeah.
and I wonder if that's partly like Mike Vrabel's influence to blame there. I know a lot of people are making Mike Vrabel the savior of the team potentially, right? Because they want
Yeah.
to get the coach or somebody fired or something like that. But I do wonder, like, hey, this is a guy who had issues. This is why he got fired in Tennessee. Is
Yeah.
he suggesting these issues to the Browns right now? And are those things becoming a problem in the Browns? Like, are you going to be willing to just like cut it out the defense completely? Because we're blitzing at like what I think 6% higher rate than we did all last season. I
Yeah.
don't understand why. Right?
Yeah.
Like I don't think that this team was built to blitz a ton. Like
No.
JOK is at his best when he sees an opportunity and he takes advantage of it. He's kind of like a quarterback who can scramble, but not a quarterback who could do design runs. Right? That's
Yes.
JOK when it comes to blitzing. He's fine as a blitzer. Like he's definitely usable as a blitzer, but he's most at his best when he's able to kind of like understand there's like going to be an opportunity here. Let me
He
shoot the
sees
gap
it
real
and
quick
goes. Yeah.
and get where
Yeah.
I need to get to. But I see a lot of them like using these nickel blitzers, these edge. Like I just don't love what they're doing to try to get
No.
pressure, and I don't understand why they're doing so much there. Because I think the sacrifice that you're making in coverage to get that pressure is actually making it harder for you to get a sack because you're providing these clear answers to these quarterbacks 10 yards down the field that they're, I mean, if Gardner Minshew can find the answers, if Daniel Jones can find the answers, any quarterback you play is going to be able to find those answers. So they have some tangible issues. I'm not trying to say all the Browns' problems are vibes right now.
Yeah.
They have some
Yeah.
tangible issues like any team, and they need to fix these issues. The question is like, okay, what are they going to do to figure this out from a locker room standpoint to get these guys back motivated again and get the problem up and going? And how are they also going to tie that to real on-field solutions? Some coaches like to bring the energy up by having a bunch of trick plays in, right? Some coaches try to bring the energy up by blitzing more often. And I think that might be why Jim Schwartz was blitzing so much last week, because it was a West Coast game. He was like, oh, I want to get the energy up. I want these guys to feel like they can go get a play. And it kind of backfired on them. So I think they just got to simplify this, understand that they're still a very talented team, and play that way. Like you got to get a better, I believe you're going to get better play from Martin Emerson sooner than later. And I think you're going to get better play from Zadarius Smith sooner than later as well, right? Like you just got to lean on these guys to make plays, and you can't just try to feed them the water here. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. I agree with you though.
Yeah, definitely. I love the analogy. The Thanksgiving analogy is perfect. I mean, that's so true, right? Like, and you probably apply that to a lot of things, but you're absolutely right. And you're right. It's not, there's a ton of issues, but like underlying all those other tangible issues, it feels like one larger issue. And yeah, so that's, I think they need a moment or something, right? And that brings them together, or some, just something has to happen to change the thinking of them as a collective.